On paper, the enormous Himalayan mountain range seems to serve as a natural border between China and India. Neither country can lay full claim to the mountains themselves, and they wouldn't be able to fully colonize them if they did, which would make it seem like there should be no border conflicts between the two nations. But there are. These conflicts center on a 2,100-mile stretch of land that runs around and through the mountains, the Line of Actual Control, or LAC. The LAC represents the longest border conflict that's currently ongoing in the world, and it's been the scene of brutal fighting since the late 1950s. In June 2020, a clash between the two nations in the Galwan Valley led to the deaths of 20 Indian troops alongside 4 from China. And as recently as December 9, 2022, Chinese and Indian forces clashed in what could have been a deadly standoff. Thankfully, no fatalities occurred, with U.S. news reporting that American intelligence fed to India may have helped Indian forces fend off a Chinese incursion. Troops wound up threatening each other with tasers and spiked clubs, with only a dozen or so injuries reported. The LAC problem still hasn't been resolved, and if a resolution doesn't come soon, it may become the trigger for war between India and China that could draw in the entire world. This brings us to the main question we'll examine in this video: who actually controls the LAC? To even begin to answer the question, we need to take a trip back in time to 1858, the official start of British colonial rule over India. In truth, the Brits had exercised control over much of India long before making the country an official colony. Through the East India Company, formed specifically to exploit and dominate trade throughout Southeast Asia, Britain had unofficially influenced and controlled India through its usurpation of the country's spice trade. Still, by the 1860s, it was in full control of the country, and as the British were wont to do at the time, they wanted to affirm that control by establishing what it could deem to be an official Indian border. The majority of these borders were established through the use of trigonomic surveys, undertaken as part of the wider Survey of India that established the borders for much of the southern regions of the country. But when it came to the north and the perils of the Himalayas, the British took a different approach. In his book, The Frontier Complex, Geopolitics and the Making of the India-China Border, 1846 to 1962, American scholar Kyle J. Gardner says that the first British survey of India's Himalayan borders was conducted in 1865. Unlike Britain's other surveys, which used precise trigonometry, the technique used for India's northern border was a traverse survey carried out by a man named William Johnson. Johnson spent much of the year traveling around what we know now as the Aksai Chin, a large portion of the Kashmir region, with the map he produced being first published in 1867 as the first depiction of that vital patch of land. But that map had problems. The map could best be described as an approximation, and at worst a complete fabrication. Gardner points out that Johnson completely failed to identify any of the water partings within the Aksai Chin. As for the perimeter of the Himalayan mountains running along his proposed border, he provided little more than a sketch. Many years later, satellite imagery would show that his sketches were not accurate. The ring of mountains he'd drawn didn't align properly with the Indus watershed limit. Much of the ring didn't even exist. Whether this was a genuine error on Johnson's part or a callous disregard for territorial etiquette, as he attempted to claim as much territory as possible for the British, isn't known. But what is clear is that his substandard work was completed, setting the stage for many border disputes that would follow. But those disputes didn't come yet. Rather, as Gardner points out, Johnson's border sketches became the first, quote, official border between China and India. Not only were those sketches problematic because they were estimates of the border, at best, but Johnson's team had failed to conduct demarcation within what we now know as the western sector of the contested border areas. The demarcation process, which requires a full team of surveyors and boundary commissioners, involves using detailed maps and boundary pillars to physically lay down a border across specific coordinates. In this case, we can say that the lack of demarcation was due more to topography than a lack of trying. The Himalayas aren't easy to navigate. The same goes for the western Singhai-Tibet Plateau and much of eastern Ladakh, all of which Johnson failed to demarcate. Still, the die was cast, a border was in place, at least to the British, and the Johnson Line, as it came to be known, was in effect. And for a time, there was little contestation of that border. China had yet to defeat Turkestan and didn't have control over what we now call Xinjiang, so it had little interest in Johnson's border. But the British weren't done there. In the decades that followed, the Brits proposed several revisions to the Johnson Line. Perhaps the most important of these came in 1897 with the Johnson-Ardagh Line, which essentially remapped the Aksai Chin. The boundary underwent alterations not due to a desire to make them more accurate, but to counteract increasing Chinese strength and changing Russian maneuvers. 2 years later, another boundary was proposed, later known as the Macartney-MacDonald Line. This new border placed almost the entirety of the Aksai Chin in Chinese control, likely as a response to China's successful annexation of Xinjiang. Here lies another problem. China never officially recognized Macartney-MacDonald Line. Though it was treated as a delimited border for a period, China didn't respond to the British document sent to Beijing to solidify the border. Clearly, China either had no interest in Britain's borders or it simply refused to respond because it had designs on taking control of more territory and thus didn't want to be on record as agreeing to a border. Adding to all this were disconnects between the British government in Delhi and those stationed at home in London. Neither could seem to settle on a cohesive border policy, with London typically arguing against the expansion that the government in India wanted to achieve as a means of defunding the country. What followed was a tit-for-tat of border changes and boundary fluctuations, influenced as much by infighting as they were by official border surveys. These fluctuations continued for decades until 1946, the year that Britain announced that it would grant India independence. But still, the British couldn't leave quietly. In August 1947, the Brits partitioned the country into two parts, the Hindu-majority India and the new nation of Pakistan, which had a Muslim majority. This created conflict in Kashmir, which the British predominantly left in the hands of India. October that same year saw a rebellion launched by Muslims in Kashmir with the aim of merging the region into the newly formed Pakistan. This rebellion led to the massacre of thousands of Muslim rebels, altering the demographic of Kashmir and helping to spark a war between India and Pakistan. Both countries claimed Kashmir. In 1949, India also accepted Britain's final attempt to draw a border between it and China, dubbed the McMahon Line. When it was first drawn up in 1914, that border was as contested as the ones before it, with China refusing to accept it or serve as a signatory on any British treaties because they didn't believe that lines drawn up by non-Asian colonizers should be recognized. Why does all this matter? In April 1948, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution demanding a ceasefire between Indian and Pakistani troops in Kashmir. The people of Kashmir should decide the fate of the region, not the two warring countries that laid claim to the land. Ultimately, this resulted in the 1972 formation of the Line of Control, a 450-mile border that essentially split Kashmir in half, with one side being controlled by India and the other by Pakistan. One border conflict was semi-resolved, but India faced a much bigger problem on the horizon: the rise of Mao Zedong. By 1943, Mao had emerged from his 22 years in the wilderness and risen to power in China with the backing of his communist allies. He established himself as the chairman of both the Secretariat and China's Politburo before engaging in a purge of those who he deemed not to be sufficiently loyal to his cause. Following that purge, Mao proclaimed China to be the People's Republic of China and set his sights on expanding his nation's territory. Tibet was the first port of call. China invaded Tibet in 1950, essentially taking control of what had long been considered something of a buffer zone between India and China in the process. That taking of Tibet had its roots in the 1914 signing of the Shimla Convention, which essentially recognized the mountain-based country as an independent state. Key to this is that China's ruling Qing dynasty of the time refused to take part in the signing of the treaty because they saw it as an affront to their sovereignty. Thus, Tibet became a disputed territory, with China's 1950 invasion intended to end that dispute once and for all. It didn't. The year 1959 brought with it an uprising in Tibet, though the rebels were quickly crushed by Chinese troops. In March of that same year, the Tibetan Buddhist leader, the Dalai Lama, fled the country and was given asylum in India. Tensions began to simmer between the two countries. In response to India's decision to provide shelter to the Dalai Lama, China attempted to claim 80,000 square miles of territory in Bhutan and the Indian-controlled region of Sikkim. China had started to cross boundaries that India believed were enshrined based on the borderlines drawn up by the British. And China wasn't going to stop there. In 1959, China's first premier, Zhou Enlai, wrote a letter to his counterpart in India. In that letter, he claimed that China and India had a fundamental difference of position related to the Sino-Indian border, which he called a complicated question left over by history. He highlighted the British aggression that had taken place toward China when India was under Britain's rule, specifically highlighting Britain granting independence to Tibet as an example of how the colonizers had muddied the territorial waters. He claimed that this move was done to transform Tibet into a sphere of British influence, positioning China as the opposition to that influence. Craftily, he also tried to play into India's history with Britain, stating that it was the subject of imperialist aggression just as China had been. But perhaps the most important part of this letter came in a new claim for territory. Zhao made a formal declaration that China would claim sovereignty over Ladakh, a region located in the east of Kashmir. There was no chance that India would accept that claim. It had already been fighting hard enough to maintain control of Kashmir. China coming in to swallow up a huge portion of that territory would be unacceptable to India, as it saw the move as an example of the very aggression that Zhao had claimed of the British in his letter. War was inevitable. In October 1962, triggered by China launching a military offensive via the Himalayan border within the Aksai Chin, India and China clashed. The conflict lasted for 32 days, coming on the back of several minor border skirmishes that started following Zhao's letter, with China coming out on top. India lost approximately 7,000 soldiers in the conflict, with most being killed while a few were captured by the Chinese. The defeat left the Assam lowlands along the border open to further invasion, which likely would have occurred if not for one thing: the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Zhao had cleverly chosen to launch his invasion during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, likely under the assumption that no major foreign power would come to India's aid over a minor border dispute. What he didn't account for was the crisis ending as quickly as it did, with the US managing to resolve the crisis in its favor. It was able to respond to then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's call for help. It sent an aircraft carrier toward India, and Zhao chose to announce a ceasefire on November 20th, rather than risk raising the ire of much more powerful Americans. Still, India had definitively lost the brief war, and with it, the country also lost control of 14,700 square miles of territory throughout Aksai Chin, roughly creating the line of actual control that is now such a contentious issue. But the LAC wasn't official yet. Though China and India managed to reach a general settlement regarding the area lying between Xinjiang and Kashmir, the relationship between the two nations was immensely damaged. Along with losing territory, the Indians were also unhappy with China for throwing its support behind Pakistan in the Kashmir region during the brief war between the two nations. Throughout the rest of the 1960s and into the 1970s, China and India would continue to accuse each other of transgressing into contested border territory. Every small move made by one was met with recrimination by the other. But those disputes didn't escalate into a full-blown war and were relatively minor compared to what had come before. Even the merging of India with Sikkim, the latter being a territory that China had claimed as its own several decades prior, wasn't enough to ignite another war. Though China condemned the move, it didn't react militarily. Instead, the two countries focused on restoring diplomatic ties. Of course, there were still problems, many of them centered around the border state of Arunachal Pradesh. If that name sounds unfamiliar, it's important to know that China considers the region to be part of Tibet and thus under its control. The area, which was formerly a part of Assam, was made an Indian Union territory in 1972, with it becoming an official Indian state 15 years later. China wasn't happy. It condemned the announcement of that statehood, even going so far as to refuse to issue a visa to the state's chief minister when he visited China, under the grounds that Arunachal Pradesh is a Chinese territory. The minister wouldn't need a visa to get into China because he was already a resident in China's eyes. Still, such conflicts were growing increasingly rare throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, though the border issue was still far from settled. It came to the forefront again in the 2010s, when China officially changed its neutral stance that it had taken between India and Pakistan during the Kargil War of the late 1990s to one of supporting Pakistan against India. In 2010, China solidified that support when it announced plans to invest $50 billion into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC project. The move could be seen as a precursor to the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, that China announced in 2013, and with it came a new twist in the border tale. China had officially thrown its support behind Pakistan and was helping it develop infrastructure that could, in time, prove a threat to India. While it would be inaccurate to claim that China's decision directly led to more border skirmishes, it's also likely no coincidence that more border clashes started occurring around this time. Several tense standoffs occurred in 2010, with 2014 bringing another confrontation in the Ladakh region. By 2017, both sides had started to build up troops at key points along the LAC, with July of that year bringing with it another standoff, this time in Sikkim. A month later, Indian and Chinese troops clashed again in the Ladakh region, with the following year bringing an announcement by China that it would cooperate with a territory called Gilgit-Baltistan on several infrastructure projects. The problem was simple. Gilgit-Baltistan is a self-governing territory under Pakistan in Kashmir. Ostensibly, it's part of Pakistan. With China's cooperation with the territory, being taken as yet another example of cooperation between China and Pakistan that could harm India in the future. Perhaps in response to this move, India chose to revoke Article 370 from its constitution in August 2019, removing the semi-autonomous state under which India had allowed its portion of Kashmir to operate for decades. The move drew widespread condemnation, with the loudest voices being those in Pakistan and China. For Pakistan, the incorporation of this disputed territory into India was an affront. To China, it was an Indian threat to its efforts to establish itself in Kashmir. All of this history brings us to the 2020s and the escalation of disputes along the LAC. Both 2020 and 2022 brought more fighting, with the former also resulting in the deaths of several soldiers. The dispute is no closer to being settled than it was in the 1960s, following the border war between India and China. Where does all of this leave us? In truth, we're no closer to answering the question of who owns the LAC than we were at the beginning of this video. India will claim ownership of various territories that China currently controls based on the borderlines drawn up during colonial times. It'll also point to China's aggression in the past, which saw it seize territory along the LAC as proof that Beijing has expanded into regions to which it should technically have no claim. China would take the opposite approach. To Beijing, the borders that India's past colonial settlers drew up were never official and certainly weren't recognized by China at the time. How could they be? They were created by invaders, colonizers, people who aren't Asian and couldn't possibly understand how the region works. China isn't trying to take territory away from India, Beijing will claim, but rather it's reclaiming territory that was illegitimately taken from it by the English. The real answer likely lies somewhere in the middle, with a resolution likely only being found if India and China can sit down and establish a clear border between the two countries. But for that to happen, India would have to change its approach to Kashmir. China would have to do the same in relation to Tibet, and both countries would have to accept that they may lose territory that they want to own in order to keep the peace. That doesn't seem likely to happen. And so we come to the last question we'll pose in this video. Why do these border disputes matter so much? Putting historical claims and the tensions that have arisen from them for so many decades aside, the reasons why the contested land matters so much as we move into the middle of the 2020s are threefold. First, there's the Brahmaputra River problem. The river flows through several countries, with India, Bangladesh, and Tibet being the most important. All three rely on the waters of the river for various reasons, with the problem arising from the fact that the Brahmaputra River's basin lies within disputed territory. Both China and India could feasibly lay claim to it, though China seems to be the country that's making the most progress in that area. Over the last few years, China has built 8 hydroelectric power projects along the lower levels of the river. Not all of these projects are operational, some are currently under construction. However, the Economic Times reports that China is currently considering the construction of a mega dam on the river, which would be placed on the Great Bend located in the Linxi prefecture of Tibet. This issue here is that China considers the river to be a strategic resource, meaning it vaguely falls under its national security concerns. India, as well as the other countries through which the river flows, would dispute this categorization, instead arguing that the river is a shared natural resource from which all that it affects should benefit. So, the problem becomes clear. By building dams along the Brahmaputra, China is effectively exercising control over a river that serves other territories. It could feasibly divert the river's waters from Tibet and into the Chinese mainland, taking away a crucial natural resource from Bangladesh and India in the process. A water war may be on the horizon. It's for this reason that several of the border conflicts between India and China have occurred within the river basin boundaries. India simply can't afford to let China control the river's flow, even if organizations like the United States Peace Institute argue that the diversion of the Brahmaputra waters would actually have minimal impact on India's water security. India doesn't want to see more Chinese infrastructure being built along the river. The fact that the two nations lack any sort of formal water-sharing agreement that enshrines how and where the river should flow only adds to the issue. The fact that China's work might increase flood risks, especially in Bangladesh, is simply another reason for India to dispute China's increasing infrastructural ambitions. Speaking of Tibet, the region also remains a point of contention between India and China, leading to the second issue. Make no mistake, India is not as interested in ensuring a free Tibet as it is in ensuring that China can't use Tibet for strategic reasons. Beyond the Brahmaputra River issues we just covered, Tibet serves as a link between China and much of Asia and has done so for centuries. It's also in the Tibet Autonomous Region, or TAR, that you'll find Arunachal Pradesh, the Indian-owned territory that China still claims is a part of Tibet. Building infrastructure within the TAR is a huge part of China's Western Development Campaign, which saw China invest billions of dollars into the region to build a rail route alongside other installations. Control of the TAR also gives China freedom to do what it sees fit with Asia's water tower, again contributing to the potential of a water war. Add to all of this the fact that Tibet is home to the huge Yulong copper mine, as well as reserves of several other minerals including iron, zinc, and lead, and you have a huge contributor to China's constantly growing economy. It's a contributor that many, including India, claim China shouldn't own. So India is interested in the TAR because it knows that the loss of Tibet would mean billions of dollars now under the control of China, as well as India being cut off from several natural resources. India would also surely not mind restoring independence to Tibet, so the state could act as a buffer that it was before Mao took the territory by force. And then there's the third issue, China's Belt and Road Initiative. Through the BRI, China's investing heavily in loans to other countries, ostensibly with the goal of helping them build infrastructure that allows those countries to compete on the global geopolitical level. We've already seen some examples of this type of investment with the Tibetan Railway and China's partnerships with Pakistan, with the latter's CPEC project being considered by some as the flagship BRI undertaking. The problem with CPEC from an Indian perspective is that parts of it pass through Jammu and Kashmir, with India claiming both those regions are theirs to control and shouldn't be a party to infrastructural developments by anybody else. As far back as 2015, India's then Foreign Secretary, Subramanyam Jaishankar, labeled the BRI as a Chinese initiative designed solely to serve the country's national interests. That opinion hasn't changed. And with increasing cooperation between China and Pakistan via the BRI, India sees another threat to its territory, along with further border disputes on the horizon. So, we return to the question we posed at the beginning of the video: who controls the LAC and the many disputed territories within and surrounding it? Officially, the answer should be neither China nor India. The LAC is supposed to serve as a border between the two, with India controlling the territory on its side and China having the same powers on the other. But the reality is that Chinese infrastructural developments are helping to assert more control over territories within the LAC, with India's response being to fortify along the disputed border in anticipation of further Chinese incursion. The irony in all of this is that both countries can lay the blame for these disputes on the English colonizers and their terrible efforts to create an official border in the first place. But that blame would mask ambitions for control on both sides of the argument, particularly as they relate to Kashmir and Tibet. Regardless, this is a conflict that isn't going to go away anytime soon, with more recent events placing India and China further away from a resolution than they've been in decades. And with that, we'd love to hear your opinions. What do you think about the constant scuffles for control occurring along the LAC? Do you believe that China, or India for that matter, may one day exploit the infrastructure they're building in this disputed territory to start a war? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching this video. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.